These are photos of Singapore's housing during its days of early independence. Meanwhile, this is what Singapore's housing looks like today, and you can immediately see the difference. Singapore's housing in the past was a slum-infested colony consisting of poor and overcrowded squatter dwellings, built from wooden planks that were prone to catching fire. In this photo, for example, over 16,000 people were evacuated after losing their homes in a tragic fire accident. The living conditions were horrific, with no sanitation, utilities, or healthcare. Laborers in the past were so poor that many could only rent beds. Some of these workers even shared pants as they could not afford their own. But fast forward to today, Singapore has entirely solved its housing problem, entirely achieved with its public housing, which is among the best in the world. They range from simple apartments to beautifully landscaped communities with swimming pools, tennis courts, and other luxury facilities. But what is truly different from Singapore is that its public housing caters to the needs of the poor and the rich alike. Therefore, living in Singapore's public housing carry no social stigma like you're financially struggling, unlike in most countries. Singapore has one of the highest home ownership rates in the world at 92%, with 82% of Singaporeans living in apartments that are subsidized by the state and purchased on 99-year leases. In 1960, almost 70% of Singapore's population were slum dwellers. By 1985, it had become a modern metropolis with more than 80% of its residents living in its public housing. Singapore's public housing is cheap and affordable enough for the poor, stylish and luxurious enough for the rich, while remaining plentiful for everyone and environmentally friendly as well. So, how did Singapore transform itself from a slum-infested colony into a world-class city in the space of 25 years? How did Singapore manage to solve the problem of housing that has plagued the country for so many years? And can Singapore's housing system be replicated somewhere else with the same degree of success? Alright, so when Singapore attained its self-governance status in 1959, it was immediately tested with a major problem: a rapidly growing population with high unemployment and a massive shortage of quality housing. In the slums where around 750,000 people live, or more than half of the country's population, there are no basic facilities like sanitation and water pipes. What is common in these squatter colonies, however, are fires and diseases like malaria, typhus, and cholera. The problem was deemed so severe that only after a few weeks after the new government was elected, the People's Action Party, or PAP for short, quickly established the Housing and Development Board, tasked with building large quantities of low-cost housing, flats or apartments, with basic sanitation and facilities. The target was to build these flats as quickly as possible and immediately rehouse the 750,000 people living in the slums. Due to the very ambitious nature of the project, the HDB was given full authority and support from the government, allowed to operate without consent from other government bodies, and it will be fully supported by the World Bank, which provided loans and technical assistance in the project. The government also did some shady things to help, and we'll talk about that shortly. But there's a big issue here. Singapore simply lacks the land needed to build these settlements. Singapore by geography is an extremely small country, just half the size of London. It has high land prices, and there was a lot of resistance and hostility both from the rich, who didn't want to give up their land, and the poor slum dwellers who didn't want to be forced out from their homes. To overcome these difficulties, Singapore made some questionable and controversial policies in order to gain some land. You see, in 1961, a massive fire broke out in the squatter settlements of Bukit Ho Swee that destroyed more than 2,800 houses and left around 16,000 people homeless. But the government saw an opportunity through the chaos and passed its fireside provision, giving the government the power to acquire any land that had been destroyed by fire for public purposes. The compensation for the landowners and occupiers was based on the current market value of the land, not the potential value. Given that a land wiped out by a raging fire is worth next to nothing, Singapore was able to buy the land at extremely cheap prices. From the Bukit Ho Swee fire accident, Singapore acquired 0.42 square kilometers of land, which the HDB then used to build 9,000 low-cost flats to resettle the fire victims and other squatters. These happened multiple times in the 1960s as the fire broke out, then Singapore quickly acquired that land, then built its public housing on it. Even when the method is questionable, Singapore was able to turn a disaster into an opportunity. But then, Singapore took this to the extreme in 1966, when the government passed its Land Acquisition Act, which gave it the power to acquire any private land it wished to be used for public purposes. No one could object to it since it was a rule, and the compensation was again based on the market value of the land, which enabled the government to acquire land quickly and efficiently. Using this very method, the government acquired a total of 177 square kilometers of land, or about a third of the entire country's land back then. When it ran out of land, Singapore began reclaiming the sea, which as of today makes up around 15% of Singapore's territory, including this area here, the Marina Bay, a development made possible through land reclamation. Singapore's state-owned land has grown from 44% in 1960 to 76% by 1985 and is about 90% as of today, which is extremely unusual in the modern age. And the HDB was given a substantial portion of it in order to build its high-rise, high-density flats that could accommodate more people in less space, and provide them with basic amenities and facilities. Now, of course, when this project was first implemented, there were obstacles along the way. As we've talked about before, many people don't want to give up their land or relocate from the slums, which prompted the government to take it by force. The project was initially viewed with hostility and suspicion. Maybe the government just wanted to take our homes for their own and leaves us to rot. Such was a common view at the time. In the early years of the project, most of the properties were just low-cost flats that looked more like an emergency shelter rather than a home. And Singaporeans were mostly unfamiliar with living in such a high-rise apartment. There was confusion over how to pay tax or electricity, and some people just have fear of heights. Living in a high-rise apartment may not be suitable for everyone. But overall, Singapore's transition from slums to high-rise apartments was extremely smooth. Within the span of 25 years, Singapore was able to entirely solve homelessness, and a lot of people who lived there were happy with the facilities as well. Sure, in the early days it's just a small flat, but that's still far superior to the squatter settlements common with the diseases. Only after the existential issue of homelessness was solved, Singapore turned its attention to making its public housing facilities better, nicer, and more environmentally friendly. Over the decades, the facilities have been upgraded with the addition of gyms, tennis courts, rooftop gardens, and so on. The units themselves vary from 1-room flats to 5-room flats or even executive condos. As of today, there are over 1 million public flats, all of them designed around the country's 24 towns and 3 estates, each with its own school, shopping centers, malls, hospitals, business districts, etc., along with a world-class public transportation system in its MIT train stations for commute between towns. The buildings are well designed, alternating between tall and short buildings to allow for air circulation, and giving the sense of fresh air and freedom rather than a sense of overcrowded and congested space that people often feel in a lot of public housing facilities, the most extreme example here being the Kowloon walled city. Now, let's talk about the massive role the HDB had in all of this, because it truly is the key behind Singapore's housing miracle. In its early years of operation, the HDB followed the British public housing model by providing only rental units. But in 1964, it began offering housing units for sale on 99-year leases, with a project named Homeownership for the People. Due to the existing poverty in Singapore back then, the HDB priced its housing units cheaply for people with income less than 800 Singaporean dollars per month. And it actually offered loans in a way that the homeowners paid less in monthly mortgage payments than they would have done in rents. But where the HDB is truly special is in how it was able to build its housing facilities so quickly and efficiently. In this table, you can see that housing units increased by about 50% in each decade from 1970 to 2000, even outstripping Singapore's population growth. The home ownership rate doubled within a decade, from 29% in 1970 to 59% in 1980, and reached 88% by 1990. It was only in the 2000s that housing construction was slowing dramatically because everyone already satisfied with their homes. Now, a major innovation and what makes Singapore's housing policy so unique is in how it integrated the CPF for housing finance. CPF, or Central Provident Fund, is basically Singapore's version of Social Security. And the way this works is that it basically forces Singaporeans to save money, as all workers under the age of 55 are required by law to contribute 20% of their wages and 17% of wages for employers, up to a monthly salary ceiling of 6,000 Singaporean dollars. This money that the government mandates its citizens to save will then be used to buy a property or for emergency expenses like medical bills. The rest will be allocated towards a retirement account after a person reaches 55 years old. This way, unlike in most countries where people themselves have to be responsible for their own finances, the Singaporean government ensures that every Singaporean will have enough saving for old age, enough money for buying a house, and this also reduces government expenditures on social welfare programs. Now, another unique thing about Singapore's housing policy is in how it is able to partially remove housing from the free market. The reason why they do this is simple. Singapore wants their citizens to view housing as a place to live, not as an investment to buy and sell. So, Singaporeans cannot own more than one flat at a time. And it's not that Singaporean homeowners cannot sell their homes, they can, but there are numerous limitations in doing so. Before 1971, Singapore homeowners who owned a flat actually couldn't sell their homes as market transactions on housing were fully banned. The owners who wanted to sell must return their property to HDB at the original purchase price plus the depreciated cost of home improvements like furniture. Today, the rules are more relaxed. Any owners of subsidized flats are able to sell their homes only after 5 years of occupancy. But there are still lots of restrictions as the government wanted to ensure that it will be able to maintain its above 90% home ownership rate. For example, while foreigners aren't banned from buying a flat, they will incur expensive stamp duties in doing so. Now, Singapore's housing system certainly isn't perfect, and there are several issues that critics often bring up. First of all, the fact that the CPF collects way more money than it needs for housing can actually crowd out consumption. What I mean by this is that the CPF mandatory savings reduce the amount of money that people have available to spend on goods and services in the economy. This can lower the aggregate demand and the economic growth rate. Moreover, the obsession of Singapore's government about home ownership has left the rent market completely obsolete. The HDB does have some rental properties, but it's mostly 1 and 2 room flats that house low-income families. There is a shortage of affordable rental units, and this is a bigger problem than you might think with the increase of foreigners looking to live, study, and find work in Singapore. Remember, foreigners can only buy homes with significant stamp fees, so there is a need for low-cost, high-quality rental properties. And finally, Singapore actually has a housing policy specifically about racial integration. This policy was a consequence of the events in the 1960s, when there were episodes of ethnic violence between the Chinese and the Malays that resulted in many deaths and injuries. Racial harmony since then has been a goal of the government, and it looks to reflect this in its housing policy. In each neighborhood, the limit is 84% of occupants for Chinese, 22% for Malays, and 10% for Indians and other minorities. This ensures that every block and neighborhood has a healthy mix of races and allow them to socialize with one another. But this also meant that buying or selling flats may be harder based on your ethnicity. For example, If you are an Indian person who is looking to sell your flat and move somewhere else, and if the quota for the whole neighborhood has already been met, you will only be able to sell your flat to another Indian person, which makes it a lot harder to sell, and some can view it as a bit discriminative as well. So, the big question: can Singapore's housing policy be replicated somewhere else with the same degree of success? Well, it's debatable, but I for one don't think that it's possible. While there is certainly a lot to learn from Singapore's housing miracle, like ensuring a healthy supply of housing, subsidies by the government, using a healthy mix of public and private markets, and clever town planning, Singapore's housing success also depended a lot on the dominance of the PAP, the political party that has ruled over Singapore from 1960 till today. Remember, Singapore took at least 20 years to be able to fully reform its housing system. If the ruling party changed every 5 years or so, the lack of long-term planning can pretty much jeopardize the entire project. Moreover, the tactics that Singapore used throughout the years, like claiming land that has been brought down by a fire, forcing its citizens to save money, and full state land ownership, can be considered both unethical and inefficient when replicated in other countries with different political and economic conditions. At best, people would disagree and protest a lot of the policies and the government's authoritarian regime. At worst, it would spawn widespread inefficiency and corruption that would effectively guarantee the project to fail. Now, as Singapore went from a poor, slum-ridden country into a rich metropolis from the 1950s to today, there is actually a country that experienced exactly the opposite. In the 1950s, it was the fourth richest economy in the world, but today, it has become pretty much a failed state. That country is Venezuela. If you want to learn about Venezuela's fall from grace, watch this video right here. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.